Thank you all for coming. I take time really, really seriously. I know in today's world our time is valuable. So we've got a short talk. I'd like to kind of explain what the kind of working philosophy behind my work is, and that's what the book is kind of built around. Essentially, 2 days after the millennium, in the year 2000, I wasn't looking for any transformation. I wasn't a spiritual seeker of any kind, and I had a fairly random interaction with an Indian holy man where he didn't even say anything to me. It was actually, I witnessed an argument between him and a chai wala. And prior to witnessing that, I had felt this overwhelming intuition to go over to where he was, and I had no idea why. And at that stage of my life, I was not someone that was even aware of my intuition, certainly not following it. I had no sense of following a hunch. Obviously it was operating in my life, but it wasn't something I was paying attention to. I wasn't really paying attention to much other than having fun. And yet, when I went over there, something happened that was so magical, that taught me in that moment that any situation, the most mundane situation, is just one moment away from being full of pure magic. In fact, it's always full of pure magic if you're paying attention. Now, I don't always remember that, and I have to remind myself of that, and that for me is what a spiritual practice is about. It's reminding me of what works and what doesn't work, and it's continually refreshing that. But what happened when I went over there, I sat down on the chai mat where I felt really attracted to this Indian holy man. He looked really old and wizened. But actually on closer inspection, yes, he was kind of weathered, but actually he wasn't that old. I guess maybe, yeah, kind of late 30s, and he had this, but he did have a wonderful grey beard. And I was just watching him. It was, I don't know, about 6 o'clock in the morning, and he had been at this kind of celebration for the millennium for days. And he was kind of grooming himself like a cat almost, and he was just something, yeah, there was something really compelling about his energy. So I went over there, really not knowing why, and then I witnessed this argument where this chaiwala, usually warm-spirited characters, quite welcoming, I guess she'd been up for days, but she basically had a go at this holy man in Hindi, so I didn't really know what was going on, but I got the gist quite quickly. He'd been there for days and he hadn't yet paid for his tea. You tend to kind of order what you want, and then when you leave the chai mat, you pay. And I was just noticing this, wondering why on earth I'd felt compelled to go over there, and then I knew exactly. And I knew this better than I'd known anything ever. I was there to pay for his tea. And I didn't want praise. I didn't want his appreciation. I felt really compelled for it to be just a simple, selfless act. Not something in those days I was hugely used to. And I was able to do it in a way where he didn't even know that I'd done it. And I walked away. And in that, I suddenly, prior to that, I had felt sorry for people that followed any kind of spiritual path. I was brought up by a very devout atheist, a very loving man, but he really did his best to condition me out of any sense of connection to spirit. And as I walked away, I felt he was a scientist, and I felt I had scientific evidence that here was someone free, living in truth, in love, no possessions, a wandering holy man, totally in faith that if he was operating with truth and love, he'd be provided for. That's the kind of premise of that way of thinking. And I had been a vessel for that to happen. That was evidence for me. And in that moment, everything changed for me. I began to find, in that instant, everything I'd ever worried about seemed to me to be preposterous. Just that I'd wasted so much time on worry and fear. I thought it was hilarious. I just thought, wow, I'm in a loving universe. I'm in a place which is balanced and ordered, and that was phenomenally good news. But I also, at exactly the same time, felt overwhelmed with grief for the time I had spent running around, making my life more complicated. And I proceeded to kind of laugh harder than I'd ever laughed and cry harder than I'd ever cried, which was not great because I was still in public. And so I jumped on my motorbike and got out of there and drove up a local hill and sat there and felt that I melted and disappeared, and it was a profound epiphany from which everything changed. And in that state I realized that fear, I hadn't realized how much fear had been operating in my life until I experienced myself without it. I couldn't have known. And what was there was a really natural, pure state of happiness that didn't need to be added. There was nothing external that could have given that to me. In fact, I, for years, had been searching for external things that were going to make me happy. And I hadn't hit rock bottom. I wasn't depressed. I thought I was happy. I thought I was a lot happier than most of my friends. But that happiness was way better than anything I'd experienced or bought for. Or really, ever since that moment, I've been obsessed with two things, really. Well, if everything I've been doing prior to that wasn't making me happy, what does? Where does real happiness come from? What are the ingredients of happiness? And the second thing was epiphany. Because when I really thought about it, that epiphany was a set of ingredients. Something I'd read in a book a week before had put me in the right frame of mind for that to be possible. And that other one experience where I was walking around a fort in North India and a tour guide just said something about all religions being a cultural attempt to answer the same problems, when I was looking at a doorway with every single religious symbol around it, and I couldn't understand. I thought people that had followed religion were just going to have their own. To see a monument that was inclusive was a paradigm shift for me. Now it's obvious, but then, and just the way in which the tour guide said, well, of course, all religions are a cultural attempt to answer the same existential challenges we're facing. These simple things made a massive difference. And so all I've really been doing these last 15 years, I mean, my private practice is a laboratory, really, in how can you line up thoughts and feelings and experiences and give people a chance to see themselves and their life differently. And it's also been an extraordinary laboratory in which to practice how to describe some of these principles, which are essentially simple but also really hard to describe. And most of my clients were people like how I used to be. They're not seekers, they're not people with lots of awareness necessarily around these concepts, but they're still really struggling with life, and they need to be given help without having to, become completely hippied up, Most of my clients are not interested in auras and chakras and all of those things. They're looking for practical, pragmatic, psychological tools that will help them be happier. And so for years I've been looking at, okay, well, we can strip away anything that might put people off. And what are the really core kind of elements? And that's turned into what my book is all about, which, as far as I can know, is the 3 pillars of happiness, which is essentially peace, power, and purpose. If we're not at peace with who we are, then no matter how much success we have or how much purpose we have, we're not going to be happy. Pillar 2, if we don't have power, if we don't have the capacity to affect ourselves and affect the world around us, if we don't have some ability to make things happen, then we're not going to be able to create a life of happiness. And pillar 3, purpose, a greater sense of meaning. But in each of these pillars, there's essentially an underlying limiting belief which is driving the show. So the pillar is about dissolving that limiting belief. So the thing that takes us out of our peace is this underlying limiting belief that I'm not okay, I'm not good enough. In pillar 2, what robs us of our power is this idea that something external is the solution. And in pillar 3, the limiting belief is that I'm separate and alone in a meaningless universe. And so in each of those pillars, the practice that I feel dissolves that core limiting belief. In pillar 1 is all about emotion intelligence, understanding how our fear impacts on us and takes us out of target and makes us feel less than, makes us feel defensive, aggressive, competitive. In pillar 2, the practice is all about success psychology, understanding what makes us tick, what makes us think, our language patterns, our belief systems, how we use our physiology, how accountability and integrity in action, being our word, all these things that are the tools by which we can actually create shift in our lives and the lives of others. And in pillar 3, it's, for me, the richest source of peace and happiness is oneness philosophy, understanding the interconnected nature of reality. And what I believe at the core root of the deepest spiritual texts, they all seem to convene on that theme of oneness. And when we understand ourselves within an interconnected, interdependent reality, then that enables us to be more at peace with ourselves and to be more in our power. And so that, I suppose, is the simplest, shortest description of what my book is really all about, and my working kind of philosophy. The one thing I will say, which I discovered, is about 5 or 6, no, it's probably now, it was in 2005, so yeah, about 10 years ago, I was using a lot of music in my work. But what I discovered to my great joy was the fact that actually art and music is one of the most beautiful ways to create transformation for people, which isn't led by the healer or the therapist. So for years I was working to create these really intricate visualizations using hypnosis and combining them with these really lovely metaphorical visualizations that would help someone heal something or improve how they felt or change their beliefs. But this one day I just had the idea, I was always using beautiful music to underpin it, but this one day I had the idea of they were very deeply hypnotized, they were in a very suggestible state, and I just said, in a few moments you'll hear a piece of music and that is the sound of your transformation happening. That is the soundtrack to the perfect visualization that will solve this for you. And I played a beautiful piece of music and shut up. And what happened afterwards, after about 3 minutes, there were tears streaming down their face, and when I talked to them afterwards, their unconscious had created this incredible visualization, which was far more elegant or eloquent than anything I could ever have created. And that got me really excited for a couple of reasons. One, his healing was much more about his own empowerment. When he left that session, he had done that for himself. I had helped. But he was far more empowered by that. But the other thing that was really exciting was that meant to me that people could do the deepest healing on themselves without a therapist. By learning these key principles, they could take themselves into highly suggestible states and then use music to get their own solutions, truly trusting that the answers are within. And now, since the last 10 years that I've been working in that way, I am stunned continuously at the creative healing power of the unconscious mind. If you set an intention and then bring consciousness and presence to your experience of art. And so on that basis I founded the Freemind Project charity, which is about bringing this to the wider awareness and promoting new ways of managing your psychology, managing your relationship to yourself, to create huge change in your lives and the lives of others. And so it's been really lovely being able to kind of summarize this for you. And that, thank you for the question as to other pillars possibly in conflict, as in if you're focusing on peace and then you've got purpose, they might conflict. And for me it's about how they come into balance, and it's knowing which practice to use at which time to keep everything in balance. But the other thing to be aware of is actually I believe all spiritual practice has a dark side. too. Like some people who are slightly addicted to peace practices, yeah, they may be meditating a lot, and they may actually be really upset with their boss, but instead of confronting their boss, they'll go home, and instead of having a beer, like they might have in the olden days, they'll meditate for 2 hours. And you arguably might think, well, that's beautiful, they bring themselves to peace, and it's like, well, not if that's enabling someone else to transgress their boundaries. So, and within Pillar 2, the dark side of Pillar 2 is spiritual materialism. So that actually people go from wanting external stuff, which is just outright like about money and experiences and more Mercedes and bigger cars, to then going to their yoga class and really wanting to touch their toes, or wanting to meditate for longer, or wanting to find the perfect guru, or wanting to go on lots and lots of workshops, or the next experience will give me my spiritual result. And in Pillar 3, one of the conflicts, one of the dangers, one of the dark sides of purpose is you can get into spiritual activism. And in many ways the world is calling for evolution, and to work to helping the world be more evolved is wonderful. But if in that your brow gets furrowed and you start taking it really seriously, and you start looking at what is and making it wrong, which would be really easy to do in today's world, then you're starting to move with the very energy which is the problem. And yes, it will take you out of your peace, but it also won't bring greatness to the world. It's just more people thinking there's something wrong. And as far as I can tell, the biggest problem in the world, and most of the problematic behaviours in the world, are driven by the idea that something's wrong. For me, in my practice, in my journey, I've gone through stages of wanting to really change the outside. And there's been beauty in that, and there's been problems. And for me, something that really helped me a few years ago was I spent my time thinking about teenagers. And I realized that in many ways, not all, but lots of teenagers are self-obsessed, fairly selfish, not very conscious, not very aware, quite gossipy, a little bit shallow. Not all of them, but lots of them. I certainly was when I was 13. And yet, that's not wrong, right? They're young, right? I was young. There was nothing wrong in that. And when working with individuals, they will present with something which is a problem. And my work is to help them bring love and understanding and compassion first. And from there, try and give them a chance to think about a new way of being which would be more exciting, without making anything wrong. And the challenge with looking out there and wanting to change it is if you can do that from a place of joy, for what's possible, like a parent would for a child who's immature but is going to be amazing. You would put your arm around them and lead them by example to greater ways of being, ideally, right? And I think that's what our consciousness, that's what human consciousness needs. Yes, there's loads at play which is in the way. But if we're looking at it and making it wrong, that doesn't work with my clients. I wouldn't say to them, oh, that's awful, you're just a terrible human. Now let's see what we can do to make it better. That wouldn't work. What we require, and I think what's being called for, is an extraordinary amount of love to be put around, an arm around the very things that are holding us down, as you said, dumbing down our development, and trusting that there is a heaviness, but it is, I think, getting better, and I think there is movement, and I think there's a lot to be amazed by the human spirit. And if you compare it to the 1800s, there's an awful lot of awareness that's occurring, and things are getting more beautiful. So for me, it's social evolution works best when it flows from a belief in what's possible, as opposed to pushes from a despair. Wrap that up as a question.
Sorry, it's not really even a question.
No, it's not. It's a reflection. Yes, let me speak to that reflection. So you've just made the reflection that it's not so much about looking externally and seeing a problem. Everything is a reflection of how we're feeling internally. And I think to some degree that's really true. I think our perspective is driven by our relationship to ourselves and the degree to which we're at peace with what is or not. And what I've realized is that can, in a lot of kind of personal development arenas, lead to people just really being focused on the happy and the positive and working really hard to ignore what's not working for them. I'm not saying that's what you were saying, but the risk is the truly inclusive response is also within your awareness, recognizing there is some part of us that can really recognize something isn't working, and what's being called for is something better. And for me, you've got a choice of kind of being excited by that evolutionary process or getting frustrated with the way that is. And your internal world, as you pointed out, will totally determine how you feel about that transitional experience. That's my experience. I don't know if that truly reflects what you were saying, but that's as best as I can respond to, I think, what you were saying, which is yes, how we feel internally really does determine our relationship to what's happening externally. Confirm what you're saying, that the most loving act sometimes is to give a very stern no, right? You know, it's our authentic response to our situation is what's the truly enlightened response. And that can include the part of you that's frustrated or angry or jealous, or it's speaking to the truth of your experience. But taking responsibility, being aware of what's happening, communicating, and taking responsibility for your emotions. Yeah, so you might still want to attack, you might still want to complain. That might be what that person, you know, would benefit to hear, whether it's fair or not. But in my own personal experience, I know the richness that comes from taking responsibility for my emotional response. But trusting that whatever occurs is generally what is supposed to happen. Now, I also agree about having some challenges around a lot of this thinking that, you know, that there's this magical process by which we attract, you know, that what we have inside and we attract, this kind of law of attraction stuff, which for me is a huge oversimplification of the principles of how reality works. For me, it's much more about alignment. It's about constantly, my practice is about aligning with that part of me that feels I'm enough, feels that nothing external is the solution, and that I'm connected. And when I can do that, I have the perspective to maintain a greater level of peace and happiness. At the same time, what appears to happen when you're in that place is it does seem quite magical. Now, what I understand is it's not about for me, my personal faith is not about an external divinity. It is about the fact that my unconscious self, which is far more intelligent than I am consciously aware of, is constantly giving me emotional stimulus to reward me for actions that are consistent with my best self coming through. Like my unconscious wants me to be more amazing. And it knows what would lead to that better than I could. So while a lot of people are receiving messages externally, they're, for me, more driven internally. And there's nothing wrong with either model that you use. And I enjoy both models at different times. But it's an awareness for me that the benevolent, loving force in my life is my unconscious. And it seems to have a much greater sense of what's actually happening. So you've asked the question, why did you, in your experience, attract someone that was so different to you and so problematic, and there was so much conflict? They were the opposite of you. And people are saying, oh, well, that's a reflection of something inside you. For me, it doesn't have to always mean that. It can sometimes, you know. For me, usually, in my experience, there's this kind of law of karma. But for me, it's not about some external divinity sending things your way. When my clients present in my practice room with a problem, they usually have a ball of emotion around it, right? Their frustration, fear, anger, whatever, right? My work, the first stage of my work, is giving them the courage to feel it without defense, to really embody that frustration. And then we journey into it, and I ask them to find times in their life when there was similar frustration which is as yet unresolved. And so it's not necessarily this person is a reflection of some hidden aspect of your character. It's much more likely that you've experienced frustration with someone like that before, and that they are in your life to give you an opportunity to become free of something which has been holding you back. And so if you were to journey into that, it's very likely that you could use a simple regression technique, which my book will show you how to do, which enables you to then find any unresolved pain, and then be free of it. And the most amazing thing, I think, about this kind of work is I know my clients are healed, which they've done themselves, when they are grateful for the thing that they first presented with. So if we were to work on this, you and I, then we get to a place where it's likely it would give you a chance to release on a memory, also a series of memories of frustration that are actually underpinning a number of feelings that might actually make it harder for you to be happy. So if we were to work on that and release that, enabling you to be considerably more at peace and happy, then that person in your workplace just blessed you, right? And so when we can begin to recognize that it's not that we've attracted it because it's a reflection of our negativity, that every situation is an opportunity to become more aware of something that we might be holding on to, then that gets pretty beautiful. What he or she, whoever created that, has just, yes, totally blessed you. But it's only when we've got the lesson and had the release and freed ourselves of that tension that we can then see the beauty in it usually. My advice to you would be to feel that anger and forget that person and say to your unconscious, I would like to be free of the original anger. And then literally just feel it, count down from 10 to 1, and be open to remembering a time from a long time ago where that anger has been stuck in you since. And I promise you, when you get that release, you will be grateful to that person for being exactly as they were, because without them, you wouldn't get that freedom, and that freedom is far richer. And just as probably a final note, for me, the most free person, arguably the most enlightened of them, the most free person, is someone who can meet the present moment in its entirety and be completely at peace with it, to say yes to it completely. What I've learned is we cannot say yes to the moment unless we can 100% say yes to ourselves, because we're in the moment, we're part of it. But we cannot be 100% at peace with who we are in that moment unless we are 100% at peace with every single thing that has ever happened to us. And that's the Freemind experience, that the process of freeing yourself of those resistances, those resentments, those judgments, those angers, so that then you can recognize that not in spite of those you're okay, but because of them. That's the difference. That's the inclusion. It's when we can come out of resistance to our experience and recognize that it's full of riches, full of empathy, full of compassion, full of all sorts of abilities to us. Then we go from complaining about what's happened to celebrating it. And in that, we're free. And we can meet every moment believing that we are the perfect person at the perfect time to say the perfect thing, including all of our paradox and our frustrations and our preferences that have been created by our past.
Have you seen that some
In my experience, the human heart, when it's beyond its fear, its resentment, its judgment, its anger, is one of the true, and the human heart's capacity to love is truly one of the greatest natural wonders of the world. When people are not being driven by their fear and resistance, then I have faith that what will come from that is generally harmonious and beautiful. But the journey of doing that, yes, involves being really honest with yourself about your shadow, about your dark side, and instead of not confronting it and ignoring it, it is about actually putting your arms around all those parts that might not be socially acceptable. Most likely won't be. And being able to love those and integrate them into a whole that then will find a harmonious balance. I believe in the human spirit deeply. In my book, one of the stories is working with someone that believed they were a demon. And they felt that if they truly connected to their core, that it would be dangerous for them and for me. And it was the most intense piece of work I've ever done. It did involve a knife being held to my throat, and I was nearly killed by him. It's very tense, it's the stories in the book, and it was about me having the faith to trust that he wouldn't kill me, even though he thought if he went through all of his pain, he would. And I definitely wouldn't recommend that as a therapeutic intervention. We both learned a lot. And I put myself massively in danger, and I did get hurt. But he didn't kill me. And actually, the reason why I got attacked was actually more my fault than his in the end anyway. But you have to read the book to hear that story. But I do truly believe that underneath it all, humans are amazing.